Welcome to a calm journey through the past, where history soothes your mind and helps you drift into peaceful sleep. These stories are more than facts. They're slow, thoughtful reflections to relax your body and quiet your thoughts. Let the echoes of time guide you gently into rest. If you enjoy these calming tales, please subscribe, like, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Now, close your eyes and let the past tuck you in.
Power. The word itself crackles with a seductive energy. It is the ultimate aphrodisiac, the most potent of poisons. Throughout the annals of human history, men and women have schemed, fought, and killed for it. They have climbed mountains of corpses to reach its glittering summit, only to find themselves alone in a desolate landscape of their own making. For some, power is a tool to build, to create, to leave a lasting legacy of prosperity and peace. But for others, it is a mirror, reflecting the darkest corners of their own souls, amplifying their insecurities, their paranoia, and their most monstrous desires. This is a journey into the heart of madness, a descent into the twisted minds of 20 of history's most unhinged rulers. These are not tales of mere tyrants or ruthless conquerors. These are the stories of men who held the known world in the palm of their hands, and who, in their madness, squeezed it until it bled. They are the emperors who danced on the ashes of their own cities, who declared themselves gods, who butchered their own families, and who dragged their empires to the very brink of collapse. From the gilded palaces of imperial Rome to the labyrinthine courts of Byzantium, we will unravel the lives of rulers who were not just cruel, but certifiably insane. We will explore the chilling evidence of their psychopathy, their paranoia, and their most monstrous desires. We will witness how their personal demons became the collective nightmare of millions. These are not stories for the faint of heart. They are chronicles of blood and terror, of unchecked power and its devastating consequences. They are a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones that lurk in the shadows, but the ones who wear crowns and sit on thrones. So brace yourselves as we open the book of history's most deranged despots and stare into the abyss of their reigns. Our first stop, the depraved and deadly court of the man who would be God, the infamous Roman Emperor Caligula. Caligula, the god of cruelty. In the grand and often bloody theater of the Roman Empire, few names evoke such a potent cocktail of horror and fascination as Caligula. His reign, a mere 4 years, was a whirlwind of sadism, incest, and megalomania that left an indelible scar on the Roman psyche. To understand Caligula, one must first understand the world that created him, a world of immense power, political intrigue and a family tree poisoned by violence and betrayal. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in the year 12 AD, the boy who would become Caligula was, in a sense, destined for greatness. His father was the beloved general Germanicus, a man hailed as a hero of the Roman people. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, a granddaughter of the first emperor, Augustus himself. He was, by birthright, a prince of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the most powerful family in the world. The nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, was given to him by his father's soldiers, who were charmed by the sight of the young boy in a miniature soldier's uniform. It was an endearing moniker for a child who would grow into a monster. But the idyllic image of the beloved army mascot was a fragile one. The Roman court was a viper's nest, and tragedy was never far away. When Caligula was just a boy, his father died under mysterious circumstances in Syria. The suspicion of poisoning fell upon the reigning emperor, Tiberius, who was also Caligula's great-uncle. The death of Germanicus plunged the family into a perilous political struggle. Agrippina, a proud and determined woman, openly challenged Tiberius, a decision that would prove fatal. One by one, Caligula's family members were eliminated. His mother and two of his brothers were arrested and exiled, eventually dying of starvation or at the hands of their jailers. The young Caligula was spared, but he was forced to live under the watchful eye of the very man he likely believed had destroyed his family. He was taken to the island of Capri, where the aging Tiberius had retreated into a life of paranoia and debauchery. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in the year 12 AD, the boy who would become Caligula was, in a sense, destined for greatness. His father was the beloved general Germanicus, a man hailed as a hero of the Roman people. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, a granddaughter of the first emperor, Augustus himself. He was, by birthright, a prince of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the most powerful family in the world. The nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, was given to him by his father's soldiers, who were charmed by the sight of the young boy in a miniature soldier's uniform. It was an endearing moniker for a child who would grow into a monster. But the idyllic image of the beloved army mascot was a fragile one. The Roman court was a viper's nest, and tragedy was never far away. When Caligula was just a boy, his father died under mysterious circumstances in Syria. The suspicion of poisoning fell upon the reigning emperor, Tiberius, who was also Caligula's great-uncle. The death of Germanicus plunged the family into a perilous political struggle. Augustapina, a proud and determined woman, openly challenged Tiberius, a decision that would prove fatal. One by one, Caligula's family members were eliminated. His mother and 2 of his brothers were arrested and exiled, eventually dying of starvation or at the hands of their jailers. The young Caligula was spared, but he was forced to live under the watchful eye of the very man he likely believed had destroyed his family. He was taken to the island of Capri, where the aging Tiberius had retreated into a life of paranoia and debauchery. The years on Capri were a masterclass in survival for the young prince. He learned to mask his true feelings, to play the sycophant, to feign loyalty to the emperor who had murdered his kin.
It was here, in this island prison of luxury and fear, that the seeds of Caligula's own madness were likely sown. He witnessed firsthand the absolute power of an emperor, a power that could raise a man to the heavens or cast him into the darkest pits of despair. He saw how fear could be used as a weapon, how cruelty could be a form of entertainment. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, the throne passed to Caligula. The people of Rome rejoiced. They remembered his heroic father and saw in the young emperor the promise of a new golden age. For the first few months, it seemed their hopes were justified. Caligula was generous, releasing those unjustly imprisoned by Tiberius and abolishing unpopular taxes. He was hailed as a savior, a breath of fresh air after the gloomy and oppressive reign of his predecessor. But the honeymoon was short-lived. A severe illness, possibly encephalitis or epilepsy, struck the young emperor, and when he recovered, he was a changed man. The mask of benevolence slipped, revealing the twisted and depraved soul that had been gestating for years. The once promising ruler descended into a maelstrom of insanity that would shock even the jaded Roman elite. One of the first and most enduring signs of Caligula's madness was his all-consuming narcissism, which quickly morphed into a full-blown god complex. He began to insist on being treated as a living deity. He would appear in public dressed as various gods and goddesses, Jupiter, Neptune, even Venus. He had the heads of statues of gods replaced with his own likeness and demanded that a temple be built to his own divinity in Rome. His most audacious act of self-deification was his plan to have a colossal statue of himself erected in the Temple of Jerusalem. This was a calculated act of provocation, a deliberate and sacrilegious insult to the monotheistic Jews. It was a move that threatened to ignite a massive rebellion in the eastern provinces, a crisis that was only averted by Caligula's timely assassination. But Caligula's madness was not confined to religious delusions. It was a deeply personal and sadistic cruelty that permeated every aspect of his reign. He took a perverse pleasure in the suffering of others, a classic trait of a psychopath. He would order executions for the slightest of offenses, or for no reason at all. He is said to have lamented that his reign was not marked by a great disaster, like a plague or a military defeat, as it would have made it more memorable. He developed a particularly gruesome method of execution, where the victims were killed slowly with small, deliberate wounds so as to feel themselves dying. He would often dine with his family while an execution was taking place in the same room, the sounds of torture providing the background music for his meal. His cruelty extended to his own family. He was rumored to have had incestuous relationships with his sisters, particularly his favorite, Drusilla. When she died, he was consumed by a grief that bordered on madness. He declared her a goddess and made it a capital offense for anyone to laugh, bathe, or dine with their family for several days. His paranoia, another hallmark of his unstable mind, grew with each passing day. He saw conspiracies everywhere and trusted no one. He would have senators executed on a whim, often for imagined slights or because he coveted their wealth. He would force them to run alongside his chariot for miles, dressed in their togas as a form of public humiliation. One of the most famous and bizarre stories about Caligula is his relationship with his horse Incitatus. He showered the animal with luxuries, providing it with a marble stable, a jeweled collar, and even a house with furniture and slaves. It is said that he planned to appoint the horse as a consul, the highest political office in Rome. While this story may have been an exaggeration by his political enemies, it speaks volumes about his contempt for the Roman elite. Whether he truly intended to make his horse a consul, or simply mocking the Senate, the tale highlights his utter disregard for tradition and his delight in a good, cruel joke. His military campaigns were a farce, a testament to his delusional grandeur.
He once marched his army to the shores of the English Channel, as if to invade Britain, only to order his soldiers to collect seashells. He then declared it a great victory over the ocean and returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph. The financial profligacy of Caligula's reign was as legendary as his cruelty. He squandered the vast fortune left by Tiberius on lavish games, extravagant building projects, and personal indulgences. He built a floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae, a monumental feat of engineering with no practical purpose other than to satisfy his own vanity. When the treasury was empty, he resorted to extortion and confiscation, seizing the estates of wealthy citizens after having them executed on trumped-up charges. The reign of terror could not last. The Roman elite, who had once welcomed him as a liberator, now lived in constant fear for their lives. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, who had helped bring him to power, now saw him as a liability, a madman who threatened the stability of the entire empire. In January of 41 AD, a conspiracy was hatched. As Caligula was leaving a theater, he was ambushed by a group of Praetorian guards led by Cassius Chaerea, a man whom Caligula had often mocked for his high-pitched voice. He was stabbed over 30 times. His wife and infant daughter were also murdered. A brutal and bloody end to a brutal and bloody reign. The Senate, in a final act of defiance, ordered the destruction of his statues and the damnatio memoriae, the damnation of his memory, an attempt to erase him from history. But they could not erase the memory of the terror. The name Caligula would forever be synonymous with madness, cruelty, and the terrifying spectacle of absolute power in the hands of a psychopath. His was a reign that served a chilling warning to the Roman world. It was a stark reminder that the same system that could produce an Augustus could also produce a Caligula. It was a lesson that they would, tragically, have to learn again and again. The specter of the mad emperor would continue to haunt the corridors of the imperial palace, and just over a decade after Caligula's death, another monster would ascend to the throne, a man whose name would become a byword for tyranny and depravity: Nero.
2. Nero, the artist of destruction. The name Nero conjures images of a fiddle playing while Rome burns, of a matricidal tyrant, of a decadent artist who saw himself as a god of the stage. He is, perhaps, the most infamous of all the Roman emperors, a figure whose reign has been immortalized in art, literature, and film as the epitome of depravity and excess. But the story of Nero is more than just a caricature of a madman. It is a complex and tragic tale of a young man thrust into a position of unimaginable power, a man whose artistic ambitions and deep-seated insecurities would collide with the brutal realities of Roman politics, with devastating consequences. Nero was born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, the same year Caligula ascended to the throne. His lineage was impeccable, a direct descendant of Augustus on his mother's side. But his family was a dysfunctional and dangerous one. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the sister of Caligula, a woman who'd witnessed firsthand the deadly intrigues of the imperial court. She was ambitious, ruthless, and utterly determined to see her son on the throne. Nero's early life was marked by instability. His father died when he was a child, and his mother was exiled by Caligula. He was raised by his aunt, living in relative obscurity. But his fortunes changed dramatically when his mother was recalled from exile by the new emperor, Claudius, who was also her uncle. In a move that scandalized Roman society, Claudius married his own niece, and Agrippina, now the empress, began to meticulously plot her son's path to power. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, changing his name to Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. She secured for him the best tutors, including the brilliant philosopher Seneca. She arranged his marriage to Claudius's daughter, Octavia. She was playing a long and dangerous game, and in 54 AD, she made her final move. The Emperor Claudius died suddenly. While the official cause was natural, many in Rome believed he had been poisoned by his ambitious wife. Before anyone could challenge her, Agrippina presented her 16-year-old son to the Praetorian Guard, who hailed him as the new emperor. Like Caligula before him, Nero's early reign was a period of promise and prosperity. Guided by Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, he governed with moderation and competence. He reduced taxes, gave more power to the Senate, and was known for his clemency.
This was the golden age of Nero, a time when it seemed that the young emperor might be the enlightened ruler Rome had been waiting for. But beneath the surface, the seeds of Nero's future tyranny were already being sown. His relationship with his mother, the woman who'd put him on the throne, became increasingly strained. Agrippina was not content to be a dowager empress. She wanted to rule through her son, to be the power behind the throne. She interfered in his decisions, criticized his personal life, and constantly reminded him of the debt he owed her. Nero, for his part, chafed under his mother's control. He was a young man with a burgeoning ego and a desire to be his own man. He was also deeply insecure, a trait that would manifest itself in a desperate need for public adoration and a violent intolerance of any criticism. The power struggle between mother and son escalated, and Nero, egged on by his new mistress, Poppaea Sabina, decided that there was only one way to be free of his mother's influence.
In 59 AD, Nero made the fateful decision to murder his own mother. But the act itself was a black comedy of errors, a testament to his theatrical and ultimately incompetent nature. He first tried to poison her, but Agrippina, ever vigilant, had been taking antidotes for years. He then designed a collapsible boat that would sink while she was sailing on the Bay of Naples. The boat did indeed collapse, but Agrippina, a strong swimmer, managed to make it to shore. Finally, in a fit of frustration and paranoia, Nero sent his soldiers to her villa with orders to kill her. When they arrived, Agrippina, with a final act of defiance, is said to have bared her womb and cried, "Strike here, for this is what bore Nero." The murder of his mother was a turning point for Nero. He had crossed a moral Rubicon from which there was no return. The guilt and paranoia from this act would haunt him for the rest of his life, fueling his descent into madness. With his mother out of the way, Nero's true nature began to emerge. His artistic pretensions, once a private passion, now took center stage. He saw himself as a great poet, a talented musician, and a gifted actor. He began to give public performances, a scandalous act for a Roman emperor who was expected to maintain a certain level of dignity and decorum. He would compete in musical contests, his victories all but guaranteed by his imperial status. He even traveled to Greece to participate in the Olympic Games, which were rescheduled to accommodate his visit. He returned to Rome with a chariot full of prizes, celebrating a triumph as if he were a conquering general. His obsession with his own artistic genius was a clear sign of his extreme narcissism. He craved the adulation of the masses, and he was pathologically sensitive to any form of criticism. He surrounded himself with sycophants who would praise his every performance, and he would ruthlessly eliminate anyone who dared to suggest he was anything less than a master artist. This artistic narcissism was coupled with a growing cruelty and paranoia. He had his wife, Octavia, executed on false charges of adultery so he could marry Poppaea. He later kicked Poppaea to death in a fit of rage while she was pregnant. He forced his former tutor, Seneca, to commit suicide after implicating him in a conspiracy. The list of his victims grew longer with each passing year,
as his paranoia and his need to eliminate any perceived threat spiraled out of control. Then, in the summer of 64 AD, came the event that would forever define Nero's reign: the Great Fire of Rome. The fire raged for 6 days, destroying a vast portion of the city. While the cause of the fire is still debated by historians, rumors quickly spread that Nero himself had started it.
It was said that he had watched the city burn from his palace, playing his lyre and singing about the fall of Troy. The image of Nero fiddling while Rome burns is likely a fabrication, but it captures a deeper truth about his character. Whether he started the fire or not, he certainly saw it as an opportunity. He used the cleared land to begin construction of his magnificent new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. It was a monument to his own ego, a sprawling complex of buildings, gardens, and even an artificial lake. The extravagance of the project, at a time when so many Romans were homeless and destitute, further fueled the public's resentment. To deflect the blame for the fire, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in a small and misunderstood religious sect, the Christians. He launched the first major persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, a campaign of terror and sadism that shocked even the jaded Roman populace. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in the most horrific ways imaginable. They were crucified, burned alive as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens, and torn apart by wild animals in the arena. The apostles Peter and Paul are believed to have been martyred during this persecution. Nero's persecution of the Christians was not born of any deep-seated religious conviction. It was a calculated act of political expediency, a way to redirect public anger and to indulge his own sadistic impulses. It was another manifestation of the psychopathic cruelty that had been unleashed by the murder of his mother. The final years of Nero's reign were a chaotic blur of conspiracies, rebellions, and ever-increasing paranoia. He saw enemies everywhere, and his purges of the senatorial class became more frequent and more brutal. The empire was teetering on the brink of civil war. The legions in the provinces, disgusted by his behavior and his neglect of military affairs, began to revolt. In 68 AD, the governor of Gaul, Vindex, rebelled, and he was soon joined by Galba, the governor of Spain. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, declared Nero a public enemy. Abandoned by his Praetorian Guard and facing certain execution, Nero fled the palace. He was a man utterly alone, a self-proclaimed god who was now a hunted fugitive. With his enemies closing in, he decided to take his own life. But even in this final act, he was plagued by indecision and a theatrical sense of self-pity. He reportedly lamented, "What an artist dies in me."
Unable to do the deed himself, he had his loyal freedman Epaphroditus help him plunge a dagger into his throat. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family that had ruled Rome for over a century. It plunged the empire into the Year of the Four Emperors, a bloody civil war that would only end with the rise of the Flavian dynasty.
3. Commodus, the gladiator emperor. If the reign of Marcus Aurelius was the serene, sunlit afternoon of the Roman Empire, a final moment of philosophical calm and stoic duty, then the reign of his son Commodus was the debauched and bloody night that followed. History is filled with the tragic irony of great men producing unworthy sons, but perhaps no chasm between father and child was ever so vast, so shockingly complete. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, spent his final years freezing on the brutal German frontier, defending the empire with his pen and his sword. His son, Commodus, would inherit the peace his father had bled for, and he would squander it in a narcissistic fantasy of gladiatorial glory and divine pretension. Born in 161 AD, Lucius Aurelius Commodus Antoninus was the first emperor in nearly a century to be born in the purple, meaning he was born to a reigning emperor. He was not an adopted heir chosen for his merit, like his father had been, but a product of dynastic succession. From his earliest days he was groomed for power, showered with titles, and taught that the world was his birthright. While his father tried to instill in him the virtues of stoicism and responsibility, the lessons never seemed to stick. The boy was spoiled, lazy, and possessed a mean streak that deeply troubled his tutors. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, likely from the plague, the 18-year-old Commodus was with him on the Danube frontier. The seasoned generals and advisors of his father urged him to finish the campaign, to secure a decisive victory over the Germanic tribes that would protect the empire for a generation. A few more months of hardship, they argued, would cement his legacy and honor his father's sacrifice. Commodus would have none of it. He had no taste for the grit and discipline of military life. He craved the adulation, the luxury, and the debauchery of Rome. In a decision that marked the first of many betrayals of his father's legacy, he hastily declared victory, signed a dubious peace treaty, and rushed back to the capital. The Roman people, weary of war, welcomed him with open arms, but the men who had served his father knew this was a dark omen. They had seen the weakness, the self-indulgence, and the petulance that lay beneath the imperial purple. For the first few years, Commodus was content to leave the business of governing to his favorites, first the praetorian prefect Perennis, and later the notoriously corrupt chamberlain Cleander. He devoted himself entirely to a life of pleasure, indulging in lavish banquets, orgies, and maintaining a harem of hundreds of men and women. The palace became a den of iniquity, while the administration of the empire began to rot from the inside.
But this life of decadent neglect was shattered by an event that would unleash the true monster lurking within Commodus, a failed assassination attempt. In 182 AD, a conspiracy was formed, led by none other than his own sister, Lucilia. She was a proud and ambitious woman who had once been empress herself as the wife of her father's co-emperor, Lucius Verus. She despised her brother's indolence and the influence of his favorites. The assassin she hired cornered Commodus in a dark corridor, but in a moment of theatrical folly, he brandished his dagger and declared, "This is what the Senate sends you." This warning gave Commodus's bodyguards time to react. The assassin was killed, and the conspiracy was exposed. The failed attempt on his life transformed Commodus. His laziness curdled into a vicious paranoia. His self-indulgence swelled into a raging, delusional megalomania. He executed his sister and countless senators he suspected of involvement. He retreated from public life, surrounding himself only with those who would flatter his ego and cater to his every whim. It was in this paranoid isolation that his most infamous obsession took root. He decided he was not a mere emperor, but a god on earth. And the god he chose to be was Hercules. This was not a subtle, symbolic association. Commodus began to appear in public dressed as the mythical hero, with a lion's skin draped over his head and carrying a heavy club. He had statues of himself as Hercules erected all over the empire. He demanded to be worshipped as Hercules Romanus. His narcissism became so extreme that he decided Rome itself was no longer a worthy name for his capital. He officially renamed the city Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The months of the year were renamed after his own various titles. The Senate was now the Commodian Fortunate Senate. The Roman people became the Commodian people. It was an act of supreme egotism, an attempt to erase centuries of history and remake the world in his own image. But his most shocking and degrading act, the one that truly horrified the Roman elite, was his decision to enter the gladiatorial arena. For a Roman emperor to perform on stage like Nero was scandalous enough. For him to fight as a gladiator, a profession reserved for slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war, was the ultimate debasement of his office. It was a complete rejection of Roman dignity and tradition. Commodus, however, saw it as the ultimate expression of his divine power. He was Hercules, and the arena was his stage. He would enter the Colosseum to the roar of the crowd, his muscular physique on full display. But his fights were a pathetic and cruel farce. His opponents were often terrified and poorly armed gladiators who knew that to harm the emperor meant certain death. He would fight and kill them, preening for the crowd, believing he was proving his martial prowess. His sadism became more pronounced over time. He would take part in the venations, the wild beast hunts, slaughtering hundreds of animals from a safe platform with a bow and arrow. In one particularly grotesque display, he had a number of cripples and amputees gathered, tied together to resemble mythical giants, and then clubbed them to death in the arena. In another, he famously killed over 100 ostriches with specially designed crescent-headed arrows that would decapitate them. Then he would stride over to the section where the senators sat, brandishing one of the bloody heads in one hand and his club in the other, a silent, terrifying threat. His reign of terror and absurdity could not last. He had alienated the Senate, the military, and even his own household. He was draining the treasury with his lavish games and personal extravagances. The final straw came in late 192 AD. Commodus, in his full Herculean delusion, announced that he would celebrate the first day of the new year not in the palace as emperor, but in the gladiatorial barracks, entering the consulship dressed as a gladiator. This was too much. His mistress, Marcia, his chamberlain, Eclectus, and the new praetorian prefect, Quintus Aemilius Laetus, knew they had to act. They were not motivated by patriotism, but by self-preservation. They knew Commodus was planning another purge, and their names were on the list.
On the evening of December 31st, Marcia brought Commodus a cup of poisoned wine after his bath. The emperor drank it, but his constitution was so strong from his years of debauchery that he merely vomited, expelling most of the poison. Fearing he would recover and take his revenge, the conspirators sent for his personal trainer, a wrestler named Narcissus. He was offered a huge reward to finish the job. Narcissus entered the emperor's chambers and found the groggy and disoriented Commodus. In the end, the man who called himself Hercules Romanus was ignominiously strangled to death in his own bathtub. His death was celebrated. The Senate immediately declared damnatio memoriae, ordering his statues to be toppled and his name to be erased from all public inscriptions. But the damage was done. The death of Commodus ended the Nerva Antonine dynasty, the line of the 5 good emperors that had given the empire nearly a century of stability. It plunged Rome back into a bloody civil war, the year of the 5 emperors. Commodus was not just a madman. He was a catastrophe. He was a ruler who possessed the absolute power of a Roman emperor, but the emotional maturity of a spoiled and cruel child. He inherited a golden age and single-handedly dragged it into the mud, driven by a pathological narcissism and a psychopathic love of cruelty. His reign was a brutal lesson in the dangers of hereditary rule, a bloody spectacle that proved that even the wisest of fathers cannot always save an empire from the folly of his son. The chaos that followed his death would eventually give way to a new dynasty, the Severans, who would produce their own share of tyrants. And in a few short decades, Rome would witness the rise of another teenager to the throne, an emperor whose madness was not one of brutish cruelty, but of bizarre religious fanaticism, the strange and scandalous Elagabalus.
4. Elagabalus, the priest-king of excess. In the long and sordid history of mad Roman emperors, a special place must be reserved for Elagabalus. While Caligula was a sadistic megalomaniac, and Nero a narcissistic artist of destruction, Elagabalus was something else entirely. He was not a product of Roman political decay in the traditional sense. He was an alien force, a whirlwind of religious fanaticism,
sexual scandal, and oriental mysticism that blew in from the east and temporarily overwhelmed the city of Rome. His reign was short, lasting less than 4 years, but it was so profoundly strange, so utterly contrary to every Roman value, that it left an indelible mark of bizarre horror on the historical record. His story begins not in Rome, but in the Syrian city of Emesa. He was born Sextus Varius Avitus Bassianus in 204 AD. His destiny was shaped not by Roman politics, but by his family's unique position as the hereditary high priests of the sun god Elagabal. This deity was worshipped in the form of a large conical black meteorite, a sacred stone believed to have fallen from heaven. From his earliest childhood, the boy who would become emperor was immersed in the ecstatic, sensual, and, to Roman eyes, decadent rituals of his faith. He was a priest before he was a politician, a zealot before he was a ruler. His path to the throne was paved by the ambition and cunning of his maternal grandmother, Julia Maesa. She was the sister of the late Empress Julia Domna, the wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. This made her an aunt of the recently assassinated Emperor Caracalla. After Caracalla's murder and the subsequent rise of the usurper Macrinus, Julia Maesa saw an opportunity to restore her family to power. From her base in Syria, she started a brilliant and audacious rumor that her handsome 14-year-old grandson, the high priest, was actually the illegitimate son of Caracalla. The story was a lie, but a potent one. The soldiers of the nearby legions, who had been loyal to Caracalla and despised Macrinus, were swayed by the boy's supposed lineage and by the vast quantities of gold that Julia Maesa showered upon them. They revolted and proclaimed the teenage priest as the new emperor of Rome. In 218 AD, the forces of Macrinus were defeated, the usurper was executed, and the boy, now known as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but forever remembered by the name of his god, Elagabalus, was the undisputed master of the Roman world. Rome waited for its new emperor with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What they got was a culture shock of epic proportions. Elagabalus's entry into the city in 219 AD was not the procession of a Roman magistrate, but the triumphant parade of an Oriental priest-king. At the head of the procession was not the emperor himself, but the black stone of Emesa, placed in a gilded chariot, with Elagabalus walking backwards before it, humbly attending to his god. For the deeply traditionalist Roman elite, this was a horrifying spectacle. The emperor was supposed to be the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, a religion centered on Jupiter Optimus Maximus. To see him subordinate himself to a strange, foreign rock was a sign that something was deeply wrong.
What followed was a systematic attempt by Elagabalus to supplant the entire Roman religious system with the cult of his sun god. This was the central obsession of his reign, the driving force behind his every action. He built a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, the Elagabalium, to house the sacred stone.
He then proceeded to desecrate the most sacred traditions of Rome to elevate his deity. He had the most holy relics of the city, including the eternal flame of Vesta and the shields of the Salii, moved to his new temple, declaring that no other god should be worshipped in Rome except Elagabalus. His ultimate act of religious sacrilege was to declare a sacred marriage between his god and the Roman pantheon. He first brought the ancient and revered statue of Pallas Athena from its temple to the Elagabalus to be the god's bride. When this seemed an unsuitable match, he sent for the statue of the Carthaginian goddess Tanit, a deity from Rome's ancestral enemy, and had it brought to Rome to be Elagabalus' true consort. The entire affair was a public relations disaster, offending the piety and patriotism of every true Roman. While Elagabalus was busy with his religious revolution, the actual governance of the empire was left in the hands of his mother, Julia Soaemias, and his grandmother, Julia Messa. But the emperor's personal behavior was so scandalous that it overshadowed everything else. His court was filled with his Syrian cronies, and he appointed his favorites to the highest offices of the state based not on merit, but on whim, or, according to his enemies, the size of their genitalia. A chariot driver was made commander of the city watch. A hairdresser was put in charge of the grain supply. His personal life was a source of constant scandal. He married and divorced 5 women in 4 years. One of his wives was a Vestal virgin, Aquilia Severa. To marry a Vestal, whose vow of chastity was a cornerstone of Roman religion, was a capital offense, a terrible sacrilege that was believed to bring disaster upon the state. Elagabalus, however, justified it with a characteristic blend of piety and perversity, declaring that it was fitting for a high priestess like himself to marry a priestess and produce godlike children. But it was his sexual behavior and apparent gender fluidity that truly cemented his reputation for madness in the eyes of Roman historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian. These hostile sources paint a lurid picture of an emperor who delighted in shattering every Roman norm of masculinity. He would wear makeup, wigs, and women's clothing. He was said to have prostituted himself in the taverns and brothels of Rome, and even set up a brothel within the imperial palace itself. The historian Cassius Dio, a contemporary senator, wrote with disgust that the emperor was termed empress, and that he had a husband, a Carian slave named Hierocles. He is even said to have sought out physicians to perform a primitive form of sex reassignment surgery, promising vast rewards to any who could give him a vagina. From a modern lens, some might interpret these behaviors in the context of gender identity. But for the rigidly patriarchal Roman world, this was the ultimate depravity, the final proof that their emperor was not just a poor ruler, but an insane and degenerate foreigner who was an affront to the gods and a threat to the very fabric of Roman identity. The end came swiftly. Even his grandmother, the shrewd Julia Messa, who had engineered his rise, realized that Elagabalus was an intolerable liability. His fanaticism and his scandalous behavior were alienating the army. the one institution whose loyalty was essential for survival. She began to groom his younger cousin, the quiet and respectable Severus Alexander, as a replacement.
Elagabalus, sensing the shift in favor, became murderously paranoid. He tried to have Alexander killed, but the Praetorian Guard, who had come to despise Elagabalus and admire the young Alexander, protected him. In a final, desperate move, Elagabalus and his mother appeared at the Praetorian camp to quell the dissent. It was a fatal miscalculation. The soldiers mutinied, seizing the emperor and his mother on March 11th, 222 AD. They were murdered on the spot. Elagabalus, only 18 years old, was said to have been found hiding in a latrine chest. Their bodies were decapitated and dragged through the streets of Rome. After being defiled and paraded as a gruesome spectacle, the body of the priest-king who had tried to remake Rome in his own image was unceremoniously thrown into the river Tiber. The Senate declared a damnatio memoriae, and the black stone of Emesa was quietly shipped back to Syria. The reign of Elagabalus was a brief, bizarre, and fiery chapter in Roman history. He was a religious fanatic and a sexual revolutionary in a society that could tolerate neither. His madness was not the cold, calculating cruelty of a psychopath, but the all-consuming fire of a zealot, a boy priest who was given absolute power and who tried to force an ancient empire to bow to his alien god. He was a cultural cataclysm in the form of an emperor, and his fall from power was as spectacular and as messy as his reign. His death wrought a temporary calm, but the Severan dynasty was far from done with its share of brutal rulers. The man whose son Elagabalus had pretended to be, the Emperor Caracalla, was himself a monster of a different sort, a paranoid killer whose brutality was as straightforward as Elagabalus's was.
5. Caracalla, the beast of Rome. In the rogues' gallery of deranged Roman emperors, some were mad with divine ambition, others with bizarre fanaticism. But the Emperor Caracalla was possessed by a far simpler, more primal, and perhaps more terrifying form of insanity. He was a beast of pure, undiluted rage. His reign was not marked by theatrical performances or strange religious rites. It was a blunt instrument of murder and extortion, a 5-year storm of paranoia, fratricide, and mass slaughter that washed over the empire in a tide of blood. His was the madness of a barracks thug, a paranoid killer who saw the world as a nail to be hammered into submission. Born Lucius Septimius Basanius in 188 AD, he was the son of the formidable Emperor Septimius Severus, a stern and effective military man who had seized power through civil war. From the beginning, Caracalla and his younger brother Geta were locked in a venomous rivalry. They loathed each other with a passion that went far beyond sibling squabbles. Their father, seeing this mutual hatred, knew it spelled doom for the dynasty he had fought so hard to build. On his deathbed in Britain, he famously gave his two sons a piece of chillingly practical advice: "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." It was a lesson in tyranny that Caracalla would take to heart, conveniently ignoring the first part about harmony. Upon their return to Rome as joint emperors, the hatred between the brothers paralyzed the government. The imperial palace was literally divided into two separate, heavily guarded sections. The two emperors never dined together, never met without their bodyguards, and communicated only through terse, suspicious messages. They lived in a state of suffocating paranoia, each expecting a poisoned cup or an assassin's dagger from the other. Rome held its breath, knowing this toxic co-regency could not last. The breaking point came in the winter of 211 AD. Caracalla, feigning a desire for peace, orchestrated a trap of monstrous cruelty. He convinced their mother, the powerful Julia Domna, to summon both him and Geta to her private apartments under the pretext of a family reconciliation. Geta, trusting in the sanctity of his mother's presence, arrived with his guard dismissed. It was a fatal mistake. As he entered the room, centurions loyal to Caracalla burst from their hiding places. Geta, realizing the betrayal, ran screaming to his mother and died in her arms, his blood soaking her imperial robes. Caracalla stood and watched, unmoved by his mother's horror or his brother's final moments. This act of fratricide, committed in the most sacred of spaces, was the defining moment of Caracalla's life. It was not a political necessity. It was an act of pure psychopathy. Having eliminated his rival, he rushed to the Praetorian camp, the true seat of power in Rome. There he declared that he had narrowly survived a plot on his life by Geta, and secured the soldiers' loyalty with a massive bonus, paid for with funds he immediately seized from his dead brother's estate. The murder of the emperor was followed by a horrific purge. Anyone who had ever been associated with Geta, friends, advisors, soldiers, even his household cooks, was hunted down and executed. Ancient sources claimed that as many as 20,000 people were slaughtered in the weeks that followed. The city of Rome was plunged into a state of terror. Caracalla had established his rule, not with charisma or competence, but with the cold, hard currency of fear.
The ghost of Geta would haunt him. He suffered from terrible nightmares and was consumed by a paranoia that bordered on delirium. He saw threats and conspiracies everywhere. But his paranoia did not make him retreat. It made him more aggressive, more brutal. He fancied himself a reincarnation of Alexander the Great, a delusion he nurtured by surrounding himself with Macedonian advisors and even organizing a 16,000-strong phalanx in the ancient Macedonian style. But while Alexander was a strategic genius, Caracalla was simply a butcher. His most infamous atrocity, an act of such disproportionate and irrational violence that it shocked the Roman world, took place in the city of Alexandria in 215 AD. The people of Alexandria were renowned for their sharp wit and satirical plays. They had taken to mocking Caracalla, ridiculing his claims of being a great warrior, and most dangerously, joking about his murder of Geta. Caracalla learned of these insults
And his reaction was not that of a statesman, but of a psychopath scorned. He marched his army to the city, announcing his arrival with a show of goodwill. He declared that he wished to honor the city and to raise a new phalanx in honor of Alexander from amongst its youth. The city's leaders and its young men, eager to win imperial favor, gathered on a plain outside the city walls. Once they were all assembled and unarmed, Caracalla gave a signal. His soldiers surrounded the crowd and, without warning, began to slaughter them. Tens of thousands of unarmed civilians were massacred in a single afternoon. To complete his vengeance, he then unleashed his army to loot the city and kill at will. It was an act of pure, insane revenge, a massacre born not of military strategy, but of a deeply disturbed and fragile ego. Caracalla's entire policy was built on his father's dying words, "Enrich the soldiers." He raised their pay to unprecedented levels, lavishing them with bonuses and privileges. This made him popular with the army, his sole power base, but it was financially ruinous for the empire. To pay for this military extravagance, he had to find new sources of revenue. He debased the currency, melting down silver coins and reissuing them with cheaper metals. And in 212 AD, he issued his most famous decree, the Constitutio Antoniniana, or the Antonine Constitution.
On the surface, it was a landmark piece of legislation granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free men and women throughout the empire. It has been hailed by some as a great act of egalitarianism. The reality was far more cynical. By making everyone a citizen, Caracalla dramatically widened the tax base. New citizens were now liable for inheritance taxes and other duties, the proceeds of which went straight into the military treasury to fund his personal army. It was not an act of benevolence. It was a desperate, empire-wide shakedown. His obsession with military glory, coupled with his paranoia, kept him constantly on the move, leading expensive and often pointless campaigns on the frontiers. In 217 AD, he was in the east, preparing for a massive invasion of the Parthian Empire, driven by his Alexander delusion. His brutality, however, had made him enemies even within his own inner circle. His praetorian prefect, Macrinus, learned that the emperor had discovered a prophecy marking Macrinus as his successor, and fearing for his life, decided to strike first. He conspired with a small group of disaffected soldiers. The assassin was a man named Justine Martialis, an officer whose brother Caracalla had recently executed on a baseless charge. The opportunity came on April 8, 217 AD. As the imperial entourage was traveling near the city of Carrhae, Caracalla dismounted from his horse to relieve himself by the side of the road. As he was preoccupied, Martialis rushed forward and plunged a dagger into his back. The assassin was killed by the emperor's bodyguards almost immediately, but the damage was done. The beast of Rome, the man who had murdered his own brother and massacred thousands, died an ignominious death in a ditch. Caracalla's reign was a portrait of pure psychopathy in power. He was a man ruled by his basest instincts
rage, jealousy, and suspicion. He left the empire financially crippled and morally bankrupt, a state held together only by the loyalty of a bloated and overpaid army. He was a stark and bloody example of the military tyranny that would come to plague the later Roman Empire. And while his madness was one of hot-blooded, brutish violence, Rome had also endured a different kind of tyrant, a man whose madness was a cold, calculating, and suffocating paranoia, the Emperor Domitian.
6. Domitian, the Lord of Fear. Long before Caracalla reign of rage, Rome suffered under a different, more insidious brand of imperial madness. It was the cold, creeping terror of a deeply insecure man, a tyrant whose cruelty was born not of hot-headed fury, but of a chilling, systematic paranoia. This was the reign of Domitian, the last of the Flavian emperors, a man who insisted on being called Dominus et Deus, Master and God, and who turned the Roman Senate into a theater of fear, where a misplaced word or a knowing glance could lead to a death sentence. Domitian came to power in 81 A.D. in the shadow of his father Vespasian and his older brother Titus. They were the celebrated military heroes who had founded the Flavian dynasty, restoring stability after the chaos that followed Nero's death. Domitian, by contrast, had been largely kept out of the limelight. He was an administrator, not a general, a poet, not a conqueror. He spent his youth feeling overlooked and resentful, nursing an inferiority complex that would fester into a monstrous narcissism once he finally held the throne. His early reign was surprisingly effective. He was a diligent, if authoritarian, ruler. He revalued the currency, engaged in a massive building program to restore the city after several fires, and demanded high standards from his provincial governors. He was disciplined, intelligent, and hard-working. But beneath this veneer of competence lay a deep-seated arrogance and a desperate need for recognition that would soon curdle into tyranny. He had no patience for the traditions of the Senate, the body that, in theory, shared power with the emperor. He saw them as an irrelevant relic and treated them with open contempt. His demand to be called Master and God was not just an act of ego, it was a deliberate statement of autocracy. It sent a clear message. He was the absolute ruler, and all others were his subjects or his slaves.
His relationship with the military was also complex. He craved the kind of military glory that had defined his father and brother, but his own campaigns on the Rhine and Danube frontiers yielded mixed results. While he was a capable commander, he lacked the stunning victories that could cement his reputation and assuage his insecurities. This failure to live up to his family's legacy likely gnawed at him, feeding his suspicion and resentment. The breaking point, the event that pushed him over the edge from a stern autocrat into a full-blown paranoid tyrant, was the revolt of Lucius Antonius Saturninus, the governor of Upper Germany,
in 89 AD. The rebellion was swiftly and brutally crushed, but it shattered Domitian's already fragile sense of security. It confirmed his deepest fears, that he was surrounded by enemies, that the senators who smiled to his face were secretly plotting his demise. After the revolt, a switch was flipped. The emperor's mind became a dark and terrifying place, and he projected his inner demons onto the world around him. He unleashed a reign of terror, primarily directed at the senatorial class. He created a vast network of informers known as dilatores, who were rewarded for bringing accusations of treason or majestas against their fellow citizens. Treason could mean anything Domitian wanted it to mean. A man could be executed for owning a map of the world, for telling a joke about the emperor, or simply for being wealthy and attracting Domitian's avarice. Trials became a grotesque farce. The verdict was always guilty, and the sentence was always death and the confiscation of the victim's property, which conveniently refilled the emperor's coffers. Domitian's cruelty was not just political, it was personal and sadistic. The historian Suetonius recounts chilling tales of his psychological torture. He would summon senators to the palace for a midnight dinner, seating them in a room where everything, from the walls to the couches to the plates, was painted black. At each man's place was a small column shaped like a tombstone, inscribed with his own name. After a terrifying meal served in dead silence by naked, black-painted boys, the senators would be dismissed and sent home, expecting assassins to arrive at any moment, only to be left in a state of perpetual anxiety. He took a perverse pleasure in the fear he inspired. It was said he would preface his most brutal sentences with a gentle, merciful-sounding preamble, so that his victims would have no hope left when the hammer finally fell. He loved to watch the faces of those he tormented. His paranoia became legendary. He had the porticos where he took his daily walk lined with highly polished fengite stone, a type of reflective marble, so that they acted as mirrors, allowing him to see if anyone was approaching him from behind. He would withdraw for hours at a time, spending his time alone in his chambers, famously catching and stabbing flies with a sharp stylus. This small, strange habit was seen by many as a terrifying metaphor for his rule, a bored and cruel god, toying with the lives of lesser creatures for his own amusement. As with all reigns of terror, this one could only end in violence. The fear Domitian projected eventually infected his own household. The final conspiracy was not formed by ambitious senators, but by the people closest to him, who acted out of pure self-preservation. His own wife, the Empress Domitia Longina, is said to have discovered a list of future victims he had drawn up. When she saw her own name on it, she knew she had to act. She joined forces with palace chamberlains and officers of the Praetorian Guard, who also feared they were marked for death. On September 18, 96 AD, the conspirators put their plan into motion. a palace steward named Stephanus, who feigned an arm injury and wore a woolen bandage to conceal a dagger, approached Domitian with news of a conspiracy. As the emperor read the fabricated document, Stephanus stabbed him in the groin.
Domitian, a tall and powerful man, fought back ferociously. He screamed for his servants and tried to grab the dagger from his attacker. The other conspirators then rushed in, stabbing him repeatedly until he was dead. The man who called himself a god died a bloody and violent death on his own bedroom floor. The reaction was immediate and ecstatic. The Senate, so long cowed into terrified silence, exploded with joy. They decreed a full damnatio memoriae, ordering his statues to be pulled down and smashed, his arches destroyed, and his name to be chiseled off every public monument in the empire. They wanted to erase every trace of the man who had tormented them for 15 years. The death of Domitian marked the end of the Flavian dynasty and ushered in a period of unprecedented stability and good governance, known as the Age of the 5 Good Emperors, beginning with the Senate's choice of the elderly Nerva to succeed him. Domitian's reign served as a dark and cautionary tale, a demonstration of how a man's personal insecurities, when combined with absolute power, could create a suffocating atmosphere of fear and death. His madness was the cold, creeping rot of paranoia, a disease that would reappear in other emperors, sometimes coupled with delusions of an even grander, more cosmic scale, as was the case with the man who would later divide the empire to save it, Diocletian.